this is something that you're really beginning a journey, right? And so you're beginning a journey or continuing a journey to have a deeper understanding of this issue. And I'm very excited that you've chosen to be here. So I'd like to begin with a poll, or this will be a second poll for you all, but how would you best define racism? So that poll should be coming up for you all. Maybe give folks about 30 more seconds, Joshua.
Will do. Okay, I'm going to end the poll.
So we have 19% of folks believe that racism is a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. We have 60%, a system of advantages based on skin color, prejudice combined with social and institutional power that perpetuates inequities, and 21% acts of oppression towards another based on racial prejudice or discrimination. And I think there's some aspects to all of these that are true, but when we're looking at a definition of racism, I think it's important for us to look at it as a system, right? It's important to look at it as a system. So it's in a system of advantages based on skin color, prejudice combined with social and institutional power that perpetuates inequities. So keep in mind, I think there's, all answers. I think there's some aspect of being correct, but when we look at the context of talking about racism, it's important that we look at that context as a system, right? When we think about race, what a lot of people don't realize is that race is a construct that was intentionally developed to control and take advantage of people. And so racism is a system of oppression that perpetuates inequities for people of color. Racism occurs at an individual level, a dyadic level, a subcultural level, institutional and societal levels. Now, for many, behaviors to uphold racism and the demonstration of racist behavior is unintentional or implicit, due to the lack of their awareness and understanding of how whiteness, race, and racism operates individually and at the systemic and institutional level. So the responsibility that each of you have, and each of us who here, that we have here, who desires to be an anti-racist, is that you're going to have to do some critical interrogation within your own lives. And that's what's a little bit different about when we're doing anti-racist work. Is a big part of the work that you're going to have to do is critical interrogation of what's going on with you. And I'll say it again during the presentation: if you're here because of work, right? If you're here because, well, I got to check this box, or this is something I need to do for work, I don't think this is going to be as beneficial for you. But if you're here because you see an opportunity for you to really learn something that's going to benefit you in all areas of your life and being able to connect more meaningfully with other people, then I think you'll have an opportunity to get more out of this presentation. So as we look at some definitions, race is a grouping of humans based on a shared physical or social characteristic, and this is something that's intentionally developed to control and take advantage of people. Racist is a person who shows or feels discrimination or prejudice against people of other races, or who believes that a particular race is superior to another. That's racist. Racism is a system of advantages based on skin color, oppression that perpetuates inequities. So racism's legacy is complex. It's brutally ugly, and it's deeply personal. And so it's important to reiterate that there is a process that you have to go through internally to be able to develop an anti-racist mindset. So let's talk about being an anti-racist. Being an anti-racist is one who actively engages in practices to dismantle systems that perpetuate inequities for people of color, right? And so the key word here is actively engaging. You know, my lens as a counseling psychologist and a counselor educator really informs how I really look at this issue, and even how I think we need to address being an anti-racist. Diversity, you know, is about learning, right? Or multiculturalism, which was the big term maybe 20, 25 years ago, is about learning what I like to call informed cultural stereotypes. Then equity and inclusion is what things should look like. However, many DEI efforts don't reach the mark because there isn't reflection on why the ideal isn't actually happening. We've invested, many companies and organizations invest in DEI work, but we've not really seen the impact of that work. And as I mentioned before, I think DEI work has been colonized and monetized, further decreasing the focus on the real issue, which is racism, white supremacy, white superiority, how it's upheld in most every institution, and how it's a systemic problem. And I'm going to define these as we go throughout the presentation. And racism requires, here's the thing, this is something that's alive, right? It requires individuals to perpetuate, promulgate, morph to be able to sustain it. So anti-racism work is not about talking about what or how things should look and, you know, gee, it would be ideal if we could be at this level, and coming out with, you know, cute little diagrams, you know, with people on stools showing this is what equity is going to look like. That's all nice and that's all important. But we have to keep in mind that anti-racist work is about sustained and engaged work to dismantle that has to be implemented by individuals. So the part of this that's often missing is that critically reflective part, which I believe you have to move through. This is a psychological and emotionally reflective process that you have to move through before you move into the behavioral. So in terms of mindsets, when we think about a racist mindset, it endorses the idea of a racial hierarchy, where an anti-racist mindset endorses the idea of racial equality. A racist mindset believes problems are rooted in groups of people. An anti-racist mindset believes problems are rooted in power and policies. A racist mindset allows racial inequalities to persevere, where an anti-racist mindset confronts racial inequalities. So I'd like to talk about interrogating whiteness. But before I dive into some components of interrogating whiteness, I want to briefly touch on why this is such a critically important component and what I like to call the smog of white supremacy. Now, I was participating in a conversation with a board that I belong to, and we were having some small group conversations, and the question came up, what do you think the most challenging thing is in doing anti-racist work? And I said, it's really for people to accept and believe that white supremacy and superiority is something that exists. And there was a gentleman, a white male gentleman in this small group that brought up a point that I found very interesting. He says, whenever I hear that or whenever that's brought up, I immediately move to a place of defensiveness, right? And we were actually talking in the context of discussing the book White Fragility, but I thought it was an important point that he brought up and at some level wanted to validate his feelings. But I think it's important for us to understand that when we're talking about white supremacy, we're not talking about we're not necessarily talking about folks in Charlottesville and this group that our president recently somewhat endorsed. We're talking about this. Well, I'll give you a definition. The white supremacy is the idea or ideology that white people and the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior of people of color, and that the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of people of color are inferior to those of white people. Now, for those psychology nerds like myself who are on this Zoom call, I want to call your attention to Albert Bandura's social learning theory, because I think this provides us an insight into this development of this white supremacy, right? Which let me add, right, this is important, that people of color can also integrate feelings of white supremacy and whiteness as a norm, right? Cannot necessarily enact it out, but can definitely buy into some of those beliefs. And that's because we're all subject to the smog, right? But an important aspect of Bandura's social learning theory is that behavior is learned from our environment through the process of observational learning. And an advancement of Bandura's social learning theory is social cognitive theory that states when people observe a model performing a behavior and the consequences of that behavior, they remember the sequences of events and use this information as a guide for subsequent behaviors. So this really offers an explanation to white solidarity, racial hierarchies, white fragility that we see in white people, but also code switching and trying not to awaken white fragility that we see in people of color. So consider this. This country was founded on racism and white supremacy. Now, this is not an anti-American statement, and this is not to be negative. This is just a factual statement that as a country, we have not wrestled with, right? We have not wrestled with that. This white supremacy permeates throughout most institutions, policies, practices, laws, etc., and is perpetuated through white racial innocence and its benefits, right? We're the most segregated than we've been in 40 plus years, right? So, and so if we keep all these in mind, we're founded on racism and white supremacy. that white supremacy is permeated throughout our organizations, policies, practices, laws, etc. We're the most segregated that we've been in 40 plus years. We also know that there is inaccurate, biased, and limited Black and African American history that's taught in our schools, right? And what is often presented, even though very limited and sparse, is presented from a deficit level. And then finally, I want you to consider that we're all exposed with a barrage of biased media in all forms of media on beauty, power, success, what being smart is, and all of those have been associated with mostly white images. And then the images of people of color and even how news is reported is always tends to be more negative. So if we look at all of that, and then if we put that against the backdrop of 401 years of racism, racial injustice, violence against people of color, many individuals, leaders, and organizations can't even say Black Lives Matter. Now think about this. If Black lives don't matter, what is less than mattering? So if we look at all of this, anti-racism is about dismantling systemic racism. So we have to begin by shining sunlight on the smog of white supremacy. So you cannot do anti-racism work or aspire to be an anti-racist without addressing race, racism, and white supremacy. And this work is personal work. It is critically reflective work. It is psychological work. It is emotional work. And this work has to be done or else it won't be effectively translated into behaviors. And we see examples of when this is ineffectively translated into behaviors when people want to quickly jump on the bandwagon, I'm an anti-racist, and then they do things. But then in the way that they actually do them, some aspects of it then begin to backfire. So with respect to the first bullet here, with respect to the first bullet, Allen and Liu said, as the United States was founded on white supremacy and continues to perceive whiteness as the standard for most all aspects of society, including beauty, hair, dress, dialect, and in our context here as educators, in achievement, school teachers and leaders cannot sit neutrally on the sideline, right? So if we consider that 75% of our educators are white, most are from segregated neighborhoods, schools, places of worship, teacher prep programs, which also lack diversity in faculty and students, when is this 75% of our workforce going to actually learn how to effectively interact and function, establish meaningful relationships with people who are different from them? Especially when we know we're not even teaching accurate history, and based on CAPE and other accreditation requirements, we don't even need to be having any of these conversations about anti-racist work, culturally responsive practice, and pedagogy. And for the majority of you all who are here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, you are required as educators to have CPR and IED training by law. But I guarantee you there are more instances of racism, micro and macroaggressions that happen in our schools than cardiovascular incidences that would warrant CPR and IED. Secondly, critical whiteness theory argues that white privilege looks normal and natural to many people. And most white people do not see the racial benefits that they accrue. So this blindness, right? And so when we're talking about this, we're talking about the normalcy of white privilege, right? I think we probably need somebody to mute themselves. someone who's experiencing the real life of parenting while maintaining their job. um, and so this blindness to white privilege impairs white people and some others' ability to recognize racism when it's operating within their organization and when it's operating in society at large, right? So it's that white privilege looking normal and natural is what impairs individuals' ability to recognize racism when it's existing in our organization and society. And even white people who are committed to reducing racial inequality can hold colorblind perceptions of themselves and society that de-emphasizes racialized structures. So I'd like to tell you a quote by Dyer, 2002. And I'm going to repeat this quote. So I'm going to say it twice. As long as race is something only applied to non-white people, as long as white people are not racially seen and named, whiteness then functions as the human norm. Other people are raced and whites are just people. I'm going to read it again. As long as race is something only applied to non-white people, as long as white people are not racially seen and named, whiteness then functions as the human norm. And other people are raced and whites are just people. There is no more powerful position than that of being just human. So white leaders and those that function from a whiteness narrative will see situations and their intentions from a whiteness or privilege lens. And this is what has to be critically interrogated. This is what has to be critically interrogated. By looking through this lens, we can also see how whiteness can truly be a commodity that provides access to other commodities and property. So these benefits and advantages gives whiteness its property value. And whiteness as property represents the idea that whiteness provides material benefit that translates into tangible value and procedural control. So there will be a conscious, metaconscious, and subconscious resistance to anything that feels like it's challenging whiteness, right? And when I say whiteness, I'm not talking about white people, although white people are the primary beneficiaries, others benefit. But what I'm saying is there's going to be a conscious, metaconscious, and subconscious resistance to anything that feels like challenging whiteness. And we see this resistance, a primary place we see this resistance is in white fragility, white neutrality, white racial innocence, and other forms. So the last point on this slide with respect to white fragility. Robin DiAngelo coined that term and defines white fragility as disbelieving defensiveness that white people exhibit when their ideas about race and racism are challenged, and particularly when they feel implicated in white superiority and white supremacy. White fragility works to maintain the status quo of systemic racism and to shut down meaningful discourse. Thus, white fragility works to maintain white supremacy, normalcy of white privilege, and whiteness as a commodity. Now, DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, is one of the most widely read books in the United States. And I've encountered many people who have read that book and still don't get it. And this is because white fragility is addressing white fragility is pre-work. It's important work. The analogy I like to use is if you're getting ready to go to work, addressing white fragility is like putting on your underwear. It's critically important work, but you're not going to show up to work in your underwear and think you're just like dressed to the nines. So white fragility, very, very important work, but it's pre-work. Now I want to make a closing point on interrogating whiteness. People of color, particularly those like myself, who have had to constantly navigate predominantly white environments, we're also very exposed to that smog of white supremacy, and sometimes knowingly and unknowingly embrace the same oppressive and white supremacy thinking in order to survive and advance in white environments. So I'm not just talking to white folks, this applies to all of us because we're all inhaling the smog of white supremacy. So we have to do undoing. We have to do some undoing. And we also have to interrogate, which sounds really weird, like interrogating our own whiteness and how we might be trying to use aspects of whiteness as a commodity. So racism infects the very structures of our society, and that's why we call it institutionalized racism. It's less about violence or burning crosses than it is about everyday decisions made by people who may not even think of themselves as racist. As a sociologist, Eduardo Bonilla Silva has said, the main problem nowadays is not the folks with hoods, but with the folks dressed in suits. So systemic racism is deep-rooted, it's deeply rooted, right? And racism itself is a learned behavior, right? It's taught and it's manifested over time via symbols, communication, policies, practices, and even silence. That's why I talked about Bandura's social learning model. So systemic racism is embedded in our society and normal practice. It leads to disparities and discrimination, and it involves the naming of white supremacy and white supremacist actions. So schools were not designed for Black folks. Schools were not designed for people of color. Schools were designed to educate white children. So we really have to take a look at the institutional, the structural, and the systemic issues and bias that exists in our current systems so that we can ensure that we're providing every student, particularly our students of color and our students living in poverty, with high quality education. And it's exciting to see that we have so many classroom teachers on this call. We have school division leaders. We have folks working in central office. I don't know who the 20% other, we could very well have school counselors on this call. We have folks in higher ed. You know, there is more conversations about anti-racist work in K-12 education. Please understand, this is not a common conversation that's happening in colleges and schools of ed from a manner that's pointed inward. The conversation is happening pointing outward. But for those of y'all in higher ed, if you're in colleges and schools of education, you have to ask yourself, why is education pre-desegregation one of the only degrees that people of color could get, right? An education degree is one of the only degrees that a person of color could get pre-desegregation, and our colleges and schools of education are now the least diverse, oftentimes the least diverse in a university, and we have this issue of a lack of underrepresented minority teachers. Please understand this is very systemic. So institutional bias is also implicit bias, and when it operates at a systemic level, it's operating within that organization structure. And that's why you'll also hear the term institutional bias, organizational bias. And so it's important to really take a look at what's happening at a systemic and a policy level in addition to a practice level, right? So institutional racism and institutional bias is also known as systemic racism and systemic bias because they're operating at systemic levels within an organization. And if we go back to the definition of anti-racist work, it is to dismantle systemic racism. So we then go to the quote or to the statement, each individual who is not actively anti-racist is working, potentially unknowingly, to perpetuate institutional racism within their organization, right? So this is oftentimes a very challenging concept for people to wrap their minds around, right? And I had a recent conversation this past Monday with somebody that says, you know, I do all of these good things, and then I get the message and I'm not really doing that much, or I'm not doing anything. I think good deeds are important, and many people have hung their hat proudly that I am non-racist. But if you are non-racist and you agree or buy into the things that we're talking about, that racism is systemic, then if you are non-racist within racist systems, then you, at the minimum, you're upholding or maintaining racism within that organization. Hence, if you're not actively anti-racist, you're unknowingly or potentially unknowingly perpetuating, upholding, and maintaining institutional and systemic racism within your organization. So we're going to go to another polling question. What example do you think is most influential in perpetuating racial inequalities to uphold white superiority in schools? Do you think it's a lack of district focus on whiteness and white privilege? Is it school-based colorblind language and mentalities, i.e. diversity and equity programming efforts? Is it classroom teachers' low expectations of students of color? And or is it lack of school division diversified curricular offerings? So we're going to give you about a minute to do this.
All right, I'm going to end the polling in just about 10 seconds.
Okay, so we see here with the results, we've got 32% lack of district focus on whiteness and white privilege, 35% school-based colorblind language and mentalities, 21% classroom teachers, low expectations of students of color, and 12% lack of school division diversified curricular offerings. I saw in the chat that a lot of people had E, all of the above. Of course, being good facilitators, we're not going to give you that easy option of the E, although E, all of the above, would be the correct answer if we did have an E. But I think what's important here that we want to really call out is that racism is at the individual level. Implicit bias is at the individual level. And because organizations and institutions are made up of individuals, it then operates and to perpetuate at the institutional level. And so what's nice about this question or the response options is that it points to the fact that we're all part of it, right? The curriculum is part of it. Classroom teachers are part of it, right? What's happening at the school division level, the central office and the school district and the leadership level. So that's that institutional level. It's operating at all of those levels. So we have to look at race, racist, racism, and our experiences within race and racism is going to be different for different people. You know, people of color, we don't really have a choice. We are confronted by issues of race and racism over multiple times a day. Folks who are white have an opportunity of choosing when to engage in those conversations. Not all the time, but most of the time. And so it goes to that whole concept of racial stamina in terms that people of color, we tend to have more racial stamina because we're living in this space. But we must all work to really develop this anti-racist mindset to eradicate the system of racism. And we have to really not just talk about racial equity, but really look at our policies and practices to ensure that racial equity really exists. So just have two or three more slides here. So we're going to be able to move to questions, and I'm going to ask Joshua possibly for a badge or some kind of a button, because I think I might end 10 minutes early, which might be the second time ever in doing a presentation. So Joshua, you can mail me that badge if I happen to finish early. But as we're looking at developing an anti-racist lens, we've got to understand our own position and assumption about race and that race matters. And this is really about developing racial literacy, right? Racial literacy is understanding the origin and function of race in society, and it is essential in being an anti-racist leader, right? The current system of racial domination generates a grammar that helps reproduce racial order as just the way things are, right? And so I say that because we have to critically reflect on language and discourse to avoid this desirabilizing or desiring of whiteness, or this whiteness as a norm. And desirabling whiteness is normalizing whiteness in our language, leaning into whiteness as a commodity in our behavior, which upholds the status quo of white supremacy. And then we must acknowledge and openly address systemic racism within our organization, and not in a defensive manner, but we've got to create a culture to where we can have open and thoughtful dialogues about race. The same way, you know, in my field in counseling, in the 1990s, we really began to look at heteronormative language in our intake forms in counseling. So you're saying man, woman, you would interview somebody doing a clinical interview, you would ask a married woman about her husband or things like that. That's an example of examining heteronormative language, right? I use as an example because those are the type of things, that's just one small example of the things that we need to do in terms of dismantling that systemic racism, having conversations, pointing those things out within your organization, and having meaningful conversations regarding that. And when I say meaningful conversations, thoughtful conversations about dismantling it, not thoughtful conversations of, well, how bad really is it? Do we really need to do it? No, conversations about dismantling it. So schools cannot achieve racial equity without explicit processes for leaders and staff to examine their personal, professional, and organizational beliefs about race. Right? So before moving on from this slide, we, you know, have got to acknowledge that of these three, the most important is the first one, which really is part of interrogating whiteness and whiteness as a norm and in understanding your own position and assumptions about race. That is going to be critical in this process. Now, 5 strategies to be an anti-racist. We've got to develop a constant level of racial awareness. Force yourself to really see race. Have those conversations. Engage in those relationships. Look at your social circles. Acknowledge the advantages based on race. Build your understanding of white privilege. Confront acts of racism and address statements and actions by others that perpetuate racial inequities. And educate white people to adapt instead of expecting people of color to assimilate. Force yourself to view all situations from the perspective of someone of color. And develop a state of perpetual critical reflection. We've got to be constantly aware of whiteness as the norm, and ways in which white superiority, supremacy, and forms of racial injustice are supported and advanced through our behaviors, through our speech, and through our discourse. So I just want to close with a quote by James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. So thank you so much. It's 5:30. Joshua, I do expect that badge or pen or something. I know you're a former principal, so you must still have a stash somewhere. And we will turn it over for questions. And I think, Cassandra, I believe you're going to help to facilitate the questions, or?
Yes, so the one question that I do have, really this deals with the issue of impact over intent. And I'm going to give you an example. For example, in a high school, is it better practice to separate HBCUs from other college pennants, for example, in a school library, to highlight them, or should they be blended in with all of the others?
Oh, I see the question. You know, that's an interesting question, and it's a very specific question. I think if you look at that from a systems level, and I think it could be either or, right? I think it could be either or, but how are you telling that story? If it's integrated in, is there a way for people to find it? Is there a way to put some attention to that? Or if it's separated, how and why, or how are you explaining the why behind why you have it separated. So I think that's an issue of actually, how are you going about doing it?
Hey, I'll jump in, Cassandra.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm asking, I'm Mike Perez, Grassfield High School. I asked the question because the first thing that we did as a community to address anti-racism, as we had a school planning council mixed with students, parents, staff members of certainly a diverse group. And that's one of the things that someone noticed straight away in the library. Wow, you have Notre Dame, Old Dominion, Penn State, don't see one HBCU. So of course, the next day we ordered them, and now I'm at that stage of which way do you go? As a half white, half Spanish man, the way that I was looking at it is to highlight it, because I have students who come and say, I want to go to an HBCU. But to blend them in, some of them may get lost if they don't know all 104, I think there are now, HBCUs. So that's why I was going to highlight them. But again, it's that my lens is a half white man, and my intention is good, and I don't want it to come again. Why is that separate?
Yeah.
So that's where I'm at, and that's the hard thing. And to follow up, so I don't have to type this, my second question would be, could you address what you think an anti-racist public school looks like? And I certainly appreciate your time and knowledge and sharing that with us all.
Thanks. And I think that's an important context that you added, in that you didn't have any before. So, because I was at least responding from the fact that you had them. So I think the fact that you have them and you added them, I think that's really important. But, you know, and this will go to your second question, which is actually a very, very big question. And I guess this is some advertising, but what we're really going to be coming together in the last session with this series. But, you know, what an anti-racist school looks like is when that school has made an explicit and outward commitment to be anti-racist, and that there is actual anti-racist work that is happening in the school. Meaning that there are things in place where leadership, right, administrators, teachers, support staff, janitorial staff, where everyone is going through some level of critical reflection and work towards being an anti-racist, and some level of a commitment from that organization. What if somebody says, oh, hell no, I don't care about this anti-racist crap? Then what are you going to do as a school leader? What are you going to do as a building leader? Are you setting that expectation when you interview? This is the organization that you're joining, right? So if you're joining this organization, please don't apply if you're not going to drink the Kool-Aid of anti-racist work. And then you're also looking at the policies and the practices. Now, here's what's going to work, what's going to create a small challenge is you might be working ahead of what a state might be doing in terms of curriculum, but there are resources and things that you can add to the curriculum, supplement, or all your teachers proficient in culturally responsive practice and pedagogy. So that is what I believe are some important components of what an anti-racist school looks like. What I can tell you or caution is what a lot of folks want to do is do one or two performative things and then showcase the work anti-racist. And I'm really on the fence on this, but I'm leaning towards it. I actually think that's worse than, you know, that's worse, because Black folks, we're kind of used to this. Now children, it's unfortunate that children have to go through this and there are deleterious outcomes for children. But I think particularly for your staff, when you say you're going to do it and it's some performative junk that you're doing, it's actually more offensive.
Thank you.
Okay, and then the next two questions actually are pretty similar. And this really has to do with the phrasing. When we talk about being aware of race, does that contradict the idea that race is a construct? And how should we begin the phrasing, being aware of ethnic and cultural differences? Does it even matter?
Well, I mean, it does. I mean, that's just a reality. It does. I mean, yes, it is a construct that was developed, to suppress, control, and take advantage of people. But trust me, it's not going to help. And please, dear Jesus, I don't want anybody leaving this presentation saying, I don't see race. I was told I don't see race, because that is code language that you don't get it whatsoever, right? And also pointing out that one Black friend you had in high school. Those are code language that you have no idea about this topic. So the reality is we have race. The reality is that we are one of few countries that actually, count surveys, job applications, everything, we look at race. So it is something that we have to really deal with, but we have to acknowledge it. The danger in saying, I don't see color, then that means that you don't see the racism that I'm experiencing. You don't see your white superiority and your white privilege. You don't see the injustice that I have to go through, so you believe that it must be me and not the racist system. So we really do have to call it out and talk about it, because if we don't see it and acknowledge it, we can't measure it, we can't change it, we can't address it.
So for those of us who are Black or of another race, how do we deal with this issue of battling fatigue, confronting racism when it hits so close to home? And or if you're white and you're having to deal with confronting racism with people that may think differently than you, as well as addressing, I'm combining two, as well as addressing this whole issue of white fragility and supremacy with people that have different perspectives without alienating them.
Well, and I think you're going to alienate them. I give the example, how much patience would you have in having a conversation with a Jeffrey Epstein supporter who think it's okay to sexually abuse young girls? If you have a friend that came to you and said, hey, Joe, I mean, man, Epstein got a bad rap, would you be comfortable alienating that person? I imagine you would be comfortable alienating that person. But why do we accept racist people in our lives? I'm sorry, some people got to go. So, it depends on your commitment to that issue. There is a beautiful meme, and I wish it did not have the B word in it, because it would be all over my social media. It's a Black woman and a white woman, and the white woman is like, it's okay to disagree. And the Black woman said, yes, B, if it's pizza, not racism. And I'm just like, yes, that is the truth, folks. That is the truth. Pizza toppings, thank you, not pizza, pizza toppings. So, we have to be prepared to lose friends over this. If you're that committed, and I view racism the same way I view sexism, the same way I view sexual abuse, the same way I view homophobia. I mean, there is no line, there is no fence. There is no fence to straddle on that issue. And in my life, I got no room for people who think it's okay to sexually abuse children, nor do I have room in my life for people who are racist. And then the issue of fatigue. I don't know how to answer that question, because I'm dealing with my own fatigue. The analogy I gave somebody, and I'll use the Epstein example, imagine being a woman who was the victim of sexual violence as a young girl, having a conversation over and over and over again with Epstein supporters who were like, the girls were 16 and 17 in some states. It would be, I mean, can you imagine? And that's the tax that people of color have to have, is this trying to talk people into believing and seeing that racism is everywhere. And then the added challenge, and I think this is the epitome of white supremacy that I have had to let some friends go, is when you're white and privileged, and you're going to tell me about the Black experience. And you're going to tell me about racism. So it gets very fatiguing. But the one thing that I can say is that for people like myself who are in positions of leadership, positions of authority, I'm sorry, we have to just find a way to support each other, and we have to keep going. But that is a tough question regarding the fatigue, because the fatigue is real. And I think for the white person who is experiencing those challenges, you know, white people created racism. White people are going to be the ones to end it. I don't think Black people alone or people of color alone are going to end racism. It's got to be white people. And so we need to get more white people engaged. So if you're getting fatigued, get your crowd, get your group of like-minded people, surround yourselves with those like-minded people, and live it through your life, through what you're teaching your children, through your circles. Joshua, how are we on time?
Oh, I wanted to say also, Dare, by the time you all get through this, these sessions, you're going to have the language, you're going to have the tools, you're going to have the mindset, you're going to have the resources, and that's half the battle, is knowing what to say and standing firm in your position. You're going to have developed it to the point where you cannot be debased so easily, right? We still suffer, but I'm glad you all are here. That's why we're doing it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gomez, who will be leading our next session, which is developing an anti-racist mindset. So you're just getting a taste of her brilliance, folks.
But it's a natural flow into the next session. We do have a few more minutes, though, Dr. Dare. I think there's a few more questions. If you don't mind staying on a little while longer to answer some more.
No, yes, sir. I'm good.
Thank you.
Okay, so this question really is about mandatory or optional. We talk a lot about, you know, how important this work is. So from an administrative perspective, how should administrators proceed as far as offering training to team members?
In the state of Virginia, you are required by law to have IED and CPR training. You don't have a choice. And I guarantee you, there are more incidences of racial micro and macroaggressions. We have the data. We have an outstanding video equity office. We have the data. Chev has the data. We have the data. So in my opinion, it should be required. In my opinion, it should be required. Now, the challenge is, what do you do with somebody that doesn't want to do it while you have a teacher shortage? It's a real challenge, you know. I think an innovative school leader, building leader, can create a culture within that school to attract those types of teachers. We can create a premium for those folks who really understand and want to lean into that issue. So if we apply the same questions to healthcare, right? If we know that a certain practice in healthcare, we realize gross oversight, oh my God, can't believe we missed it in 400 years of healthcare, but you know, there's a new way of doing something. The way you did it before is bad. How would you as a hospital administrator respond to that? To that one physician, no, I don't really want to get the training. I want to continue doing it the way that I've done it before. So it's just about the will that you have to do it.
And actually, as a follow-up to that, there was another question as it relates to bringing in coworkers who may be resistant. You know, everybody wants to please everyone and be nice to everyone, but how do you conquer the resistance of people, and as it relates to this work?
Well, you know, I served on the Virginia, the Commission of African American History and Education. And, I think we've got to start one with education. I'm having these conversations a lot. And one of the things I realize is that there's just a fundamental lack of history that many people have. And when they begin to understand that history, for some, it really helps to soften them to really understand these issues. Like when I talk about the intentionality around the misinformation that we're taught in schools. One of the examples I like to use is George Washington's dentures. There's a nice, beautiful story how they're made out of wood. He pulled the teeth of his slaves to make his dentures. That's intentional information that's not put in the history books. So I think the more we can ensure that this information is being taught and people understand that there is a real history here, and folks can really understand the intentionality behind why the history is not taught, and even why we slant how the current history is taught, I think it does soften some people up. But I think we have to, the tough question is, do you want a doctor treating you who is using an antiquated practice that will hurt 50% of your patients? That's the question. So do you want that or not? And what do you do about it? Do you make it a soft requirement? Do you make it a hard requirement? I mean, we have the data to support it. It's there.
I believe we have time for one more question, Dr. Dare, before we go to our closing segment.
And I think this one we're going to get to in a future session, but it relates to talking about, should we be talking about being aware of racism or being aware of race?
I mean, I think we have to do both. We have to be aware of race, and we have to be aware of racism, and we have to be aware of systemic racism. We have to be aware of white superiority. We have to be aware of white privilege. We have to begin to understand and tackle white solidarity, white racist discourse. I mean, there's a lot that we have to interrogate and understand. And just because I use the term white, it's not just white people. I mean, we can see that in the news. We can see that in the media. It's not just white people. But if you're white, it is most likely you're doing this unintentionally. But please know, people of color, we're complicit in this also.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dare. I know we could stay on all night and have this dialogue, but you helped us start the conversation, an ongoing conversation for several more months. Well, a conversation beyond this series that we want to keep going. But for the purposes of this series and for the purpose of tonight, I'm going to send you that badge in the mail. It's going to be a flame because you were definitely on fire. We appreciate what you brought, the information, yourself, and engage the audience. And audience, I hope you feel the difference in this type of PD than a standard webinar or anything else that is boxed. We're really trying to make this as personal as possible to even the 200 plus people who are a part of this series. And so we thank you for your engagement tonight, even though we're virtually, but it's so nice we can connect all over the country. With that, I want to set the expectations for moving forward in what's next in our final 10 minutes here tonight, because we will end on time in respect of your time. And we have several sessions ahead in this series. Now, some of you signed up for Package A. That is on Tuesdays, and Package B is on Thursdays. Package A is a little longer. It's a 2-hour session, and it's only 100 people max. We haven't fully maxed out yet, and we're still allowing registrations to occur. But there'll be more small group interaction and actually a bonus session after all of this next summer. And in Package B, they'll be similar to tonight in a sense, not as long, more of a lecture standpoint, but definitely follow-up reflection questions. And both groups are going to receive a personal assessment that you can take, and then we'll take again at the post after we're all done to help you see your own personal growth in this area. And that will be sent to you before our next session, our first official session, developing an anti-racist mindset. And we already got a chance to hear a little bit from our first presenter, but I'm going to allow Dr. Gomez to introduce herself and just give a brief overview of what you can expect at the end of this month.
Hey there, everybody. It's so nice to see everybody. Yes, I am Dr. Gomez. I am in the School of Education in Teaching and Learning, and our session, Developing an Anti-Racist Mindset, we're going to dive deeper into what it means to be racist, anti-racist, racism. We are going to unpack those terms in contemporary and historical context. We will take a historical walk back in time to explore the invention of whiteness in this country. I think this is what is lacking for many folks. We're going to look at how race has been and continues to be socially constructed and reinvented over and over again. And more importantly, why? Why does this happen? Why were racial categories constructed? What purpose did they serve in economics and social policies until today, right? Such as in our institutions of education and our apparatus of the state, right? So what is the purpose? And how the permanence of systemic stratification by race has been the driver of popular ideology in the psyche of US Americans, all of us, right? The ideology that I'm referring to is whiteness ideology. And as Dr. Dean Dare mentioned earlier, we're not talking about white people, we're talking about an ideology, a macro systems level ideology that we are socialized to live within, right? Throughout this session, we're going to do what I call turning the mirror on ourselves in order to identify and unpack our individual and collective positionalities that influence and drive our conscious and unconscious biases, and how we center whiteness unintentionally and intentionally as the bar to which we are all measured, right? And then work toward effectively undoing that socialization into whiteness ideology. I have a lot more to say, but I know I have more colleagues and I'm running out of time.
Dr. Gomez,
I look forward to meeting all of you and on Zoom again.
I can tell you're ready to roll for the end of
I'm ready to go.
I gave Dr. Gomez a little extra time, but we're going to briefly hear from everyone you're going to learn from this year. Dr. Cormier. Are you with us, Dr. Cormier? Dr. Cormier is going to talk.
I'm here.
Okay, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I didn't realize we was introducing ourselves. I thought it was
just real brief. I want him to get a chance to hear your voice and see your face.
Yes. Sorry, I'm in a quiet library, but I'll make it brief. Okay. I will be doing a presentation on implicit and unconscious bias and talk about how we can, use that knowledge to understand how we can engage one another, but also how sometimes we use those biases to hide behind and not necessarily be proactive or reactive to racist ideas or actions.
Thank you, Dr. Cormier. Sorry to put you on the spot there. We'll see you in November.
All right, see you in November.
Dr. Ferguson, your presentation for December.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tamika Ferguson. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and the interim assistant dean for student affairs and inclusive excellence. So I look forward to our session, mostly because we will really dive into the history of systemic racism, really thinking about the ways in which our society was constructed, how the permeance of race has invaded every factor of society, all of our social, economic, political, educational institutions, and how its existence creates these opportunities for us to perpetuate it rather than us creating ways in which we can stop it. But in that same conversation, we would talk about how historical oppression and the ways in which colonialism has erased culture and language, and how we're still seeing the impact of that today. And the goal through those examinations are to identify the opportunities that we can have to reconstruct and replace those narratives that continuously marginalize and oppress people of color and those from other marginalized backgrounds.
Thank you, Dr. Ferguson. In the new year, we're going to have a duo present to us, Dr. Wilkinson and Ms. Braxton.
Yes, good evening, everyone. Myself and Giovanna Braxton, who I think is on the call as well, so I'm sure she'll wave to you all, are excited to be providing our session on advancing race conversations to assess the impact of power and privilege within organized systems. So critical to this assessment will be an exploration of whiteness, anti-Blackness, and people of color, and then how these groups exercise power and privilege differently within the systems in which they operate. And so additionally, participants will use an anti-racist lens to formulate and strategize power and privilege on how they can dismantle racism. So we're super excited to be seeing you guys at the top of the year, because we're going to make it, I promise.
Yeah, thank you both very much. Dr. Kuba.
Hello, everyone. I'm Melissa Cuba, and I'm very excited to be here with you. So I'm a postdoctoral research fellow with the Metropolitan Educational Research Consortium. And like many of you, I was a teacher for 15 years, working in ESL and special education, and witnessed many problems with the eligibility process for emergent bilinguals, so English learners, and saw how Black and Latinx students were overrepresented, particularly in self-contained classes. So I'll be drawing a lot from my practitioner lens, but also my research, which is looking to examine and enhance evidence-based practices and policies to mitigate disproportionality. And so in my session, I'll be looking at racializing of ability, so really drawing on the historical context, which is so important. Also, the racial segregation of students and how we use that within schools, communities, and classrooms, and applying an intersectional lens to really look at how students of color are represented and positioned within systems, and how they're mentioned in policy, whether they're invisible or viewed through a deficit lens. And so I'll be really asking you to think about your own context, both temporal and spatial context. And I'm really excited to be able to connect with you.
Thank you, Dr. Kuba. Appreciate it. Next, in March, we have Rodney Robinson. He is the 2019 National Teacher of the Year. And as you can imagine, Mr. Robinson is very busy, so he took the time to send us this video message to welcome you all.
My name is Rodney Robinson, and my session will be on designing anti-racist student support systems. There's an old African proverb that says, "Those who are not embraced by the village will burn it down or feel its warmth." In my session, we will examine support systems in the village necessary to create student success. We will focus on practices in the classroom that challenge and change the power structure in the school and the school community that are barriers to success for our students. We will discuss ways to empower our students through curriculum representation, culturally relevant practice, and overall change in mindset of how they view their education. I look forward to meeting you all and sharing what I've learned in my 20+ years of classroom experience in Richmond Public Schools.
And we definitely look forward to hearing from Mr. Robinson in March. In April, Dr. Liu.
Hi, everybody. I'm Luciana de Oliveira, and I'm Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Professor in the Department of Teaching and Learning here at VCU. My area of focus is TESOL, as I mentioned in the chat box. And for my session, we are going to be analyzing current work environments using an anti-racist lens and identifying some actionable items needed to sustain anti-racist policies and practices. So primarily, we will build upon the knowledge of systemic policies and practices that perpetuate racism by looking at, your own environments and thinking about and considering how to build anti-racist environments that are sustainable, which is really critical for this work. So we'll be also doing some of those critical self-reflections that Dean Dare mentioned at the beginning of his session, and really thinking about how to sustain anti-racist systems.
Thank you, Dr. Liu. Appreciate you. And we'll be closing out this entire series in April with the gentleman who kicked us off. So Dr. Dare, anything you'd like to say about your series in April and also bring closure to tonight?
Great, thanks so much. So in April, I'll be doing presentations on doing the work, allies, accomplices, and co-conspirators. And so the goal for this last session is to really bring everything together. From a critically reflective lens, how do we do anti-racist work? With this being the last session, I'll assume that people have already begun to do some anti-racist work. So how can we draw from what you all have learned throughout this series, what you've learned from the work that you've done, so that we can actually strengthen and improve that? But how do we also ensure that there's sustainability to that anti-racist work individually or and systemically? So we're looking forward to that. You know, as you all can see, we've got an outstanding group of professionals and scholars that are participating in this Becoming an Anti-Racist Educator series. You know, we have choice in how we want to spend our time and resources, and I'm so glad that you all have chosen to spend your time here. And I hope this initial session has met your expectations, and I'm confident that the future sessions will definitely meet your expectations. So thank you so much. I appreciate you all on a professional level, but I also appreciate you all on a personal level, because you're all educators. So you're here looking to do this work, right? And on a personal level, that is going to improve the lives of children that look like my children. That's going to improve the lives of people who look like me, and who look like Lou, and who look like Rachel, and who look like Tamika, and looks like Rodney. And so this is personal work to me. This is personal work along with professional work. So I thank you, and I appreciate each and every one of you all. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Dare. As we close, I see quite a few different questions and suggestions in the chat. Please know that everyone will get a recording of this as a kickoff session, and we're going to leave registration open until our first official session later this month. I'll also send calendar invites so you can have these on your calendar saved. Thank you for your patience as we've organized this. It is a pleasure to have the problem of over 200 people interested in this series. So we are embracing you being a part of this on our journey, as Dr. Dare said, and we look forward to our future sessions together. Thank you for your time, engagement, and have a wonderful evening.